The morning the Wentfield family sent their third daughter to the Duke of Grenvar, they were still laughing around the breakfast table as her trunk was loaded onto the carriage outside. Her mother did not come to the door. Her elder sisters watched from the upstairs window with quiet, satisfied smiles. Her father had signed the contract the night before with his finest pen, the one he only used for things that truly mattered to him. This did not matter to him at all. Her name was Tilda. They called her plain Tilda. Not with sharpness, just with carelessness. The way people set aside something they have already decided holds no value. The Duke of Grenvar had written requesting a bride. The family had 3 daughters. 2 were accomplished and already spoken for. So they sent the third, half as a joke, half as a convenience, expecting absolutely nothing to come of it. But not one of them thought to ask what kind of woman the Duke had actually been waiting for. Not one of them wondered why a man of his rank, his land and his fortune had remained unmarried this long. The moment Tilda stepped through his iron gates, travel-worn, unannounced, and entirely herself, the Duke looked up from across the courtyard and went completely still. That one moment changed everything for both of them. Now, if you had been standing in that courtyard watching her arrive, what would you have felt? Drop your answer below and tell us the beautiful part of the world you are watching from. If this story is already pulling at you, hit subscribe because it has barely started. The iron gates of Grenvar Hall had not opened for a woman in 11 years. The old gatekeeper, a stout man named Burrell, with fingers thick as candles, nearly dropped his lantern when the carriage rolled up that Tuesday morning. It bore no noble crest. No footman rode ahead to announce it. No letter of introduction had arrived the day before, as was proper custom. The carriage was modest, and the single trunk tied to the back of it was even more modest. Burrell squinted at the papers the driver handed down to him. He read them slowly, his lips moving. Then he read them again. The name on the contract was Miss Matilda Wentfield, 3rd daughter of Lord Alton Wentfield of Crestbury, age 22, no listed accomplishments, no listed dowry. A thin scrawl of ink where her mother's signature should have been, suggesting the woman had signed quickly, perhaps while already in the middle of something else entirely. Burrell looked at the carriage door, then at the papers, then at the carriage door again. He opened the gates. The carriage moved up the gravel path, its wheels crunching in the morning quiet. Frost still sat on the grass. The old oak trees stood like silent judges on both sides. Servants paused near the east wing to watch. A laundry maid tugged the sleeve of the girl beside her. A stable boy climbed 2 rungs up a fence post to get a better view. Nobody had been told to expect a guest. They were watching because they were curious, not because they were ready. The carriage stopped. The door opened. Tilda stepped out. She wore no elaborate travelling coat. Her hair was pinned, simply one loose strand falling near her jaw where the wind had pulled it free during the long journey. She carried a small leather satchel in her left hand, the kind a governess might carry. She looked up at the full face of Grenvar Hall, all 4 stone floors of it, the high windows and the ivy creeping along the eastern wall. And she did not flinch. She breathed it in slowly. Her expression was not awe. It was quieter and more careful than awe. It was the face of a woman preparing herself for something she has been waiting a long time to face. Across the courtyard, a door opened. Silas, the Duke's steward, a tall and narrow man with iron-grey hair and a face that had long ago forgotten how to be surprised by anything, stepped out with a ledger already open in his hands. He had prepared himself to receive trunks, a maid, perhaps a chaperone. He had not prepared himself for a young woman stepping down from a carriage alone and standing in the courtyard with the steady posture of someone who believed, quietly but completely, that she had every right to be there. He crossed the courtyard toward her. His eyes moved over her quickly. Nothing in his face changed, but something behind his eyes was already working. "Miss Wentfield, I presume?" "Yes." Her voice was clear, not loud, not performing itself for anyone, simply clear. "The Duke was not informed of your arrival date. My family did not send word ahead." Silas paused at that. It was a pause that said a great many things without saying any of them aloud. He closed the ledger under his arm. "Please come inside. I will inform His Grace." He turned. She followed. She noticed everything. The way staff straightened automatically as Silas passed. The way two younger maids at the end of the far corridor whispered behind their hands without meeting her eyes. The paintings along the main hall, dark and old, the kind that seemed to track your movement. A large fireplace with no fire lit yet. A vase of late autumn branches on a side table, sparse and striking, in a way that nothing about Crestbury had ever been. Grenvar Hall was not a warm house, but it was not a cold one either. It was a serious house. Everything inside it felt like it carried weight. She was shown to a sitting room. A fire was brought within minutes, which surprised her. Tea followed. The young maid who delivered it, a freckled girl named Dottie, set the tray down and stole 3 separate glances at Tilda before retreating to the doorway. Tilda poured her own tea and sat by the window. Outside, the frost was beginning to pull back from the edges of the grass. The ground stretched wide and bare and honest, making no attempt to impress anyone, simply being exactly what they were. She liked that immediately. She thought about her mother that morning, standing in the doorway of the Crestbury house, without a coat on, watching the carriage pull away with the same expression she wore when setting aside something she had already decided was not worth keeping. No grief, just relief wrapped in finality. She thought about her eldest sister Petra, who had said at dinner 2 nights before, in that easy conversational tone she used when she wanted something to land without appearing to throw it, that at the very least Tilda would have a house to live in now. Even if the Duke returned her, Grenvar was said to be scenic, even if the Duke returned her. Tilda set down her cup. She had known her whole life what her family thought of her. She had not spent that life arguing against it. She had simply kept going, reading everything she could find, walking every corner of the Crestbury estate alone, studying her father's land maps when nobody wanted them, standing at the edges of rooms where important men spoke and storing everything she heard. She was not nothing. She had simply never been stood in the right light. The sitting room door opened. She stood. The Duke of Grenvar entered, and he stopped in the doorway before crossing the threshold, which was not the movement of a man who filled rooms out of habit. He stopped and looked at her the way she had looked at the grounds outside, with real attention, as though what he was seeing actually mattered, and he wanted to see it correctly. His name was Cade. He had fought one war, inherited a failing estate, rebuilt it entirely without outside assistance, and had not attended a London ball in 4 years because he found almost nothing about them worth his time. He had written to Lord Wentfield because a mutual acquaintance had mentioned the family had daughters of suitable age. He had not asked for accomplishments or beauty or fortune. He had asked, plainly, for a woman of honest character and reasonable mind. That was the full extent of his requirement. What he had expected was an introduction letter, then a formal visit, then a proper arrangement stretched across several weeks. What he received instead was a woman standing in his sitting room. No chaperone, no ceremony. A loose strand of hair near her jaw and eyes that were looking back at him with as much attention as he was giving her. He walked in, the door closed behind him. Miss Wentfield. He did not bow formally. He inclined his head. Silas would explain to Dotty later, quietly, that this was actually more significant. Your Grace! She dipped simply, no performance in it, with a steadiness that told him she had made a decision somewhere on the long road from Crestbury to Grenvar, and that decision was to arrive as herself, and nothing else. You came alone. Yes, no chaperone. My family did not arrange one. Something moved across his face and settled, like water finding its level. Were you told anything about this arrangement before you came? She held his gaze. I was told to pack and be ready before dawn. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down, and he gestured for her to do the same. Outside the sitting room door, pressed very close to the wall, Dotty held her breath and tried with everything she had not to make a single sound. Word reached the Wentfield house by Wednesday. Not from Tilda. Tilda had not written. The word came through a cousin of Lord Alton Wentfield, who had business dealings near Grenvar County, and had passed through the village inn where the locals were already talking. People near Grenvar always talked. The Duke was not a man who went unnoticed. The word that reached Crestbury was simple and short. The Duke had not sent her back. Lord Alton Wentfield received this at the breakfast table and said nothing immediately. He finished his toast. He poured a second cup of tea. Then he set the cup down with slightly more force than was necessary and looked across the table at his wife, Lady Hester. Lady Hester Wentfield was a woman built entirely around social position. She wore it the way other women wore their finest jewels, at all times, deliberately, and in a way that made it very difficult to notice anything else about her. She had 3 daughters. She had invested heavily in the eldest 2. Petra was engaged to Sir Barton Gruel of the Shropshire Gruels, which was a fine match. The middle daughter, Glyn, was being steadily courted by a naval officer from a well-regarded family. Tilda had always been, in Lady Hester's private and an honest estimation, a loose thread. Not bad, not troublesome, simply inconvenient in the way things are always inconvenient when they refuse to fit neatly into your plans. Sending her to Grenvar had been Lord Alton's idea, and Lady Hester had agreed because it solved a small problem without requiring significant effort. The Duke had written. They had a spare daughter. The paperwork was technically correct, even if the spirit behind it was entirely dismissive. They had expected a politely worded rejection within a week. The Duke of Grenvar was known for his manners even when he was not known for warmth. But he had not sent her back. Lady Hester set down her spoon. It is most likely courtesy. He will not keep her past the month. Petra tilted her head. with an expression that wore the costume of concern, but was actually something sharper underneath it. Perhaps he simply has not gotten around to the formality of a rejection yet. Their agreement about Tilda had never once required debate. It had always simply been shared. Nobody at that table wondered, even briefly, how Tilda was managing. Nobody asked whether she had been cold or frightened on the long journey. Nobody thought to ask what she had said when she arrived, or how she had been received, or whether the house suited her. Meanwhile, at Grenvar Hall, Tilda was not cold or frightened. She was, in fact, seated in the Duke's library. This had happened because on the morning of her second day, she had asked Silas directly whether there was a library on the property. Silas had confirmed that there was, and had added, in a tone shaped carefully to suggest a clear boundary, that it was the Duke's private library. The proper response to this information was to nod graciously and walk in the other direction. Tilda had nodded and walked straight toward it. She was not reckless. She knew precisely what she was doing and had reasoned through it beforehand. A man who had surrounded himself with nearly 1,100 books, which she had counted along the shelves within the first 15 minutes, was not a man who would take offense at someone who simply wanted to read them. She had made a judgment, and she was willing to stand behind it. She was right. The Duke had found her there an hour later, sitting cross-legged in the large chair beside the east window, with a volume of agricultural reform essays open across her knees. This was not what he had expected a young woman of her background to be reading in someone else's library on her second morning. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than he intended to. Then he walked in, took the chair 2 seats from hers, and opened his own book without comment or explanation. Silas, passing the open door at that exact moment, stopped so abruptly that he nearly walked into himself. They sat in the library together for nearly 2 hours. There was not much spoken between them, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence set between 2 people who are both genuinely thinking and have no impulse to fill the air with empty sound. At one point, without lifting her eyes from the page, Tilda asked whether the Grenvar estate had ever tried crop rotation on the northern fields. The Duke looked at her for 3 full seconds before he answered. Once, 15 years ago, under the previous steward, it was abandoned. Why? The steward left. His replacement had different priorities. And the current arrangement for those fields? Silas manages the house. The fields are my direct concern. She nodded once and returned to her reading. He did not return to his, not for several minutes. The rest of the Grenvar household was watching all of this with the careful, focused interest of people who have not been given anything this compelling to observe in a very long time. Mrs. Callow, the housekeeper, a solid woman in her 50s, with a voice like polished dark wood and opinions she kept behind her teeth until they were fully formed, told Silas on Wednesday evening that the girl had iron in her spine. She meant it as the highest compliment she was capable of giving. Burrell the gatekeeper told the stable master, a quiet and capable young man called Theo, that when Miss Wentfield had stepped down from the carriage and looked up at the hall, she had not looked like a woman admiring it. She had looked like a woman measuring it. Theo found this worth thinking about. Dotty had informed 2 of the other household maids that the Duke had smiled once in the library. briefly and without realizing anyone was watching. At something Miss Wentfield had said under her breath while turning a page. Dotty had been watching. There was one other presence in Grenvar Hall whose feelings about the new arrival were considerably colder than the rest. Colonel Prist Danwick was a distant cousin of the Duke, who had occupied the comfortable West Wing rooms for 3 years, and had built himself, in that time, a quiet assumption of influence over the household that nobody had ever directly granted him. He was 53, broad through the shoulders, with a military bearing he had stopped earning years ago, and a habit of entering rooms, as though the people inside should be grateful for his arrival. He had been at dinner on Tilda's second night. He sat across from her and asked 3 questions in a row, each one sharper than the one before it, disguised as polite conversation but functioning as an examination. Her education, her accomplishments, what the Wentfield family held in land and standing. Tilda answered each one without hesitation, without apology, and without any attempt to soften or elevate herself. She simply answered directly and honestly, which was somehow more unsettling to him than nervousness would have been. He had been prepared for timidity. He did not know what to do with composure. The Duke sat at the head of the table and said nothing during this exchange. But at Danwick's 3rd question, he looked across the table at him with an expression that Silas recognized immediately, and that Dotty was still turning over in her mind the following morning. It was not anger. It was something quieter than anger and considerably more final. Danwick changed the subject. By Thursday, 2 facts were settling themselves quietly across Grenvar Hall. The first was that the Duke had no intention of dismissing Tilda quickly. The second was that Tilda had no intention of making herself smaller to ease the discomfort of the people who had expected her to. Back in Crestbury, a letter was written. Lord Alton Wentfield composed it himself, addressed it directly to the Duke of Grenvar, and sent it by first post. It was polite and carefully worded. It inquired about the timeline of the arrangement and whether His Grace required any additional documentation regarding Miss Wentfield's background and family standing. It did not ask how Tilda was. Not one line of it asked how she was. The Duke read the letter once, standing by the window in his study. He folded it and held it a moment. Then he turned and handed it to Silas, who had appeared in the doorway with his usual precise timing. "File it. Shall I prepare a reply, Your Grace?" The Duke considered this for a long pause. Not yet. Silas filed it without another word. In the library, Tilda had moved on to her 3rd book. Through the tall windows, the frost was long gone. The northern fields of Grenvar spread wide and brown. In the pale afternoon light, quiet and patient, and full of the kind of possibility that had simply never been given the right attention. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she turned the page. Colonel Pristet Danwick wrote his letter on Friday night, after the household had gone quiet. He did not use the Duke's writing room. He used his own desk in the West Wing, door locked, a single candle burning low. He had composed versions of this letter 3 times already in his head, testing the weight of each word before committing anything to paper. He addressed it to Lady Hester Wentfield of Crestbury. The letter was not overtly cruel. Danwick was too practiced for cruelty that could be traced. It was carefully sympathetic in tone, the kind of sympathy that carries a blade inside it. He wrote that he found himself concerned, as a man of conscience, about a young woman placed in circumstances her family had, perhaps not fully considered. He wrote that the Duke, though admirable in many respects, had a complicated household history that warranted cautious attention from those who cared about her. He wrote nothing specific enough to be challenged. He wrote everything specific enough to plant fear. He sealed it, addressed it in plain handwriting so no one would recognize it as his, and handed it to his personal man, Grout before sunrise the following morning with instructions to post it from the village rather than from the hall. Grout was a thin, obedient man of 40 who had served Danwick for 12 years and had learned in that time that asking questions always cost more than answering them. He left before breakfast without a word. What Danwick wanted was not complicated. He had lived at Grenvar Hall 3 years under the quiet assumption that the Duke, who had no wife and had shown no serious interest in acquiring one, would eventually need guidance in matters of estate succession. Danwick had a son, a dull but presentable young man of 25 named Ferris, positioned in his careful imagination as the natural future of Grenvar if the Duke remained without an heir. Tilda had not been part of that plan. More specifically, the way the Duke looked at Tilda was not part of that plan. Danwick had attended enough courts, enough negotiating tables, enough drawing rooms in his 53 years to know when a man's attention had genuinely shifted. He had seen it at the dinner table. He had seen it when he passed the library doorway and found the Duke sitting 2 chairs from the girl with his own book closed across his knee, not reading it. The Duke was listening to her. That was the detail that had settled cold in Danwick's chest, not polite amusement. The Duke was listening with the full attention of a man, hearing something that was moving, something loose inside him, something fixed too long in one position. Danwick wrote the letter. Then he went to breakfast and smiled pleasantly at everyone. What he did not know was that Tilda had already partially found him out. It had happened the previous afternoon. She had gone to return a book to the upper library shelf, and on her way back through the corridor behind the west wing, she heard Danwick's voice through a partly open door, speaking to Grout in a low, deliberate tone. She did not stop walking. She was not a woman who loitered in corridors. But the corridor was long, and the door was open, and she had hearing sharpened across years of being the person in the room that nobody thought worth watching. She heard the words "the family," a proper arrangement, and the Duke does not yet see clearly. She heard Grout's short agreement. Then she heard the door shift, and she was already 4 steps further along, pace unchanged, face forward. She thought about it all evening and said nothing to anyone. She had no complete picture yet, and going to a man with an incomplete story was not her way. But she began watching Danwick more carefully, which was its own kind of answer. On Saturday morning, something happened that shifted the weight of everything considerably. Tilda had developed a habit of walking the grounds before breakfast, studying the Grenvar estate the way she had once studied her father's land at Crestbury, with the particular focus of someone genuinely interested in how things work and why. She had already noticed the poor drainage along the north field, a failing stone wall near the west paddock, and tenant cottages at the far edge of the property in worse condition than anything else on an otherwise well-maintained estate. On Saturday, she went further east and found the river path, and on the river path she found Theo. He was crouched near the bank, examining a collapsed section of the low stone retaining wall that kept the eastern field soil from washing into the water during heavy rain. He had a notebook open in his hand, making rough measurements. He looked up when she approached, registered no particular surprise, and returned to his notebook. "It has been going this season," he said, not explaining to whom or for whose benefit, simply stating it the way men state facts, when too focused on the problem to bother with formality. Tilda crouched beside him and looked at the damage. The wall had been built on a shallow foundation. Water had worked beneath it across several winters. Not a difficult repair if done correctly and done soon. "Has this been reported to the Duke?" "Silas has it in the ledger. Work order has been sitting for 3 weeks." Theo glanced at her sideways. Estate finances were tight earlier this year. Repairs got ranked. She looked down the river path. If the wall failed further before it was addressed, the soil loss would be significant, and the cropping potential of that entire eastern field would be set back by years. "Do you have the measurements for the full damaged section?" He held out the notebook. She read carefully, turned a page, read further, and handed it back. "There is a method using layered stone packing and chalk fill that holds in wet soil conditions. Less expensive than a standard rebuild and holds considerably longer. My father's groundsman used it on the Crestbury east boundary 12 years ago. I can write it out if it would be useful." Theo looked at her, not the sideways look from before, a straight one. "It would." She was back inside and writing at her small desk before breakfast was served. She finished the notes, folded them, left them with Silas addressed to the Duke, then went down to eat. Danwick was already at the table. He watched her arrive with an expression carrying friendliness on its surface and something considerably less friendly beneath it. "You were out early," he said. "I was." She reached for the bread. He waited for more. She offered none. At the far end of the table, the Duke arrived, sat, and almost immediately Silas appeared at his shoulder with the folded note. He read it at the table, which was unusual. He read it twice. He looked up and found Tilda already watching him. Not with expectation, simply with the straightforward attention she gave to most things. "You walked the river path this morning?" "Yes." "Silas tells me this was your second time past the east field this week." "Third," she corrected, without apology. Danwick's hand tightened around his fork. "The chalk fill method," the Duke said. "You have seen it work?" 12 years of holding the wall." "Yes." He nodded once, slowly. Danwick looked between them and understood, with the particular clarity that comes when something feared has been confirmed. That time was not on his side. The letter reached Crestbury on Monday. Lady Hester read it alone in her sitting room, with the door closed. She read it 3 times. Then she called for Petra. Petra arrived, read the letter herself, and set it down with the expression of a woman handed exactly the information she already wanted. "Someone in that house is concerned," Lady Hester said. "Someone in that house is useful," Petra corrected. The plan was decided before dinner. Petra would travel to Grenvar under the pretense of a sisterly visit. Enough time had passed since Tilda's arrival that a visit would appear natural, even considerate. Nobody needed to know what she was really coming to assess. Sir Barton Gruill offered his second carriage for the journey without being fully told why, which was characteristic of him. Barton was agreeable in the way that certain furniture is agreeable, present, functional, and entirely unlikely to object to anything. Petra arrived at Grenvar Hall on Wednesday morning. Burrell opened the gate. She stepped out of the carriage with the full force of a woman who had spent her entire life understanding how to enter a room. Accomplished, beautiful by every standard measure, wearing her family name like armor polished daily, Silas received her and went immediately to find the Duke. Tilda was in the library when she heard the carriage. She went to the window and recognized Petra by posture alone before she could see her face. The way her eldest sister moved had always carried the particular quality of someone who expects the space ahead of them to clear. And it usually had. She watched Petra cross the courtyard and felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, not anger, something more composed than either. The feeling of understanding exactly what is coming and having already decided how to meet it. She closed her book and waited. The Duke received Petra in the main sitting room with full courtesy. Petra delivered her explanation warmly, without hesitation. She had come simply to see her dear sister, to ensure Tilda had settled comfortably, and to pay her respects to His Grace, of whom the whole family thought so very highly. The Duke listened, thanked her. His face gave nothing away. When Tilda entered the sitting room, Petra stood and opened her arms. Tilda accepted the greeting and stepped back. "You look different," Petra said, studying her openly. "The air is different here." Petra smiled with great warmth. It was a perfect smile. "We have all been so concerned. Mama especially." Tilda said nothing to this. The silence sat where an agreement might have been and was clearly not one. Petra redirected smoothly toward the Duke, asking about the estate, the grounds, and the county's social calendar. She was charming in the way of people trained from childhood to perform charm as a function rather than an expression. She laughed at the right moments and asked questions that sounded like interest but were actually inventory. The Duke answered pleasantly and gave her absolutely nothing. Danwick arrived at the doorway 20 minutes into the visit. He had heard the carriage. He came in with broad, welcoming energy, greeting Petra as though they were old acquaintances, which startled her briefly before she calibrated. The two of them understood each other within minutes, the way people with matching intentions always do. Tilda watched Danwick cross the room toward Petra and understood the shape of it completely now. He had written to her family. He had drawn Petra here. The purpose was to use Petra's presence and the family's implicit low opinion of Tilda to destabilize whatever was forming between her and the Duke, to make the Duke see her through their eyes. It was almost clever, and it would have worked on a different kind of man. That evening, Danwick arranged a private moment with Petra in the corridor before dinner. Tilda was not present. Mrs. Callow, however, whose habit of being exactly where she was needed had nothing to do with eavesdropping and everything to do with efficiently managing a large house, was at the far end of that same corridor folding a delivery of pressed linens. She heard enough. She went directly to Silas before the first dinner course was served. Silas heard her out with his customary stillness. Then he walked to the Duke's study. He did not knock. In 11 years he had knocked every single time except twice, and both previous exceptions had involved genuine urgency. The Duke looked up from his desk. Silas told him everything: the name Grout, the village post office, the letter sent to Crestbury, the conversation between Danwick and Petra about the value of the family, reasserting their position over where Tilda was situated, which in practical terms meant pressuring the Duke toward ending the arrangement on the grounds of her social inadequacy. The Duke sat back in his chair and said nothing for a long time. Silas stood and let the silence be whatever it needed to be. "Was Miss Wentfield told?" "Not to my knowledge, Your Grace, though I believe she has drawn her own conclusions about the Colonel." Another pause. "Dinner is in 30 minutes, Silas said. "Yes." The Duke stood, straightened his coat, and his face, which had moved through something considerable in those quiet minutes, came out the other side resolved. Dinner was a performance of civility from every direction. Petra was radiant and fully engaged. Danwick was expansive and jovial. The Duke was courteous to everyone and warm to no one in particular. Tilda ate quietly, said little, and watched everything. It was at the end of the main course that the moment arrived. Petra had been making a graceful and entirely strategic observation about how remarkable it was that Tilda had managed so well, given that she had always been far better suited to quiet, simple zesting nice life than to the real demands of a significant estate. The comment was designed to land softly and cut deep. It landed exactly as designed. A brief silence settled around the table. The Duke set down his glass. He looked at Petra with an expression Silas had seen only twice before in 11 years. It was not anger. It was something considerably more serious than anger and more permanent than warmth. "Miss Wentfield," he said, and the table understood from his tone alone that he was not speaking to Petra, "submit a structural repair proposal for the eastern river wall this week. I have reviewed and approved it. My steward has confirmed it to be the most cost-effective and technically sound solution to a problem this estate has carried for 3 years." He set both hands flat on the table. She identified it on her 3rd morning. Petra's smile remained. Her eyes did not. Danwick reached for his wine. Tilda looked at the Duke. She found him already looking at her. Not with the weight of a pronouncement, not performing anything for the room. Simply looking at her the way he had looked at her in the courtyard on that very first morning, with full and deliberate attention, as though she was exactly what she was, and that was to him more than sufficient. She looked back steadily. Outside, wind moved fast along the northern fields. The river ran cold in the dark. Somewhere on the estate, Grout sat in his small room in the west wing, turning a coin in his fingers, beginning slowly to understand that the man he served had miscalculated something he could not yet name. And in the west wing corridor, a folded letter that Danwick had kept as personal insurance. A second letter he had written and not yet sent, one with considerably more damaging content than the first, sat inside a locked wooden box beneath his writing desk. It would not stay there long. Grout left the west wing at 10:30 that night. He did not leave by the main corridor. He used the servants' passage along the back of the house, the narrow one connecting the west wing to the old laundry yard, which had a side gate opening onto the lane, without passing Burrell at the gatehouse. He had used it twice before on Danwick's instruction and knew its geography well enough to manage it in low light. What he had not considered was Theo. Theo slept above the stables, directly beside the laundry yard. 15 years of managing horses through cold nights had trained him to wake at any sound from below that did not belong to the natural settling of the building. He had been lying still since 9, turning over in his mind what Mrs. Callow had said quietly at supper about a locked box in the Colonel's room and a letter that had not yet been posted. He heard the yard gate click. He was at his window before the sound had finished. Grout crossed the yard with the tight, fast steps of a man trying to move quickly without appearing to. He was carrying something flat inside his coat. Danwick had made the decision to move after dinner. The Duke's open and deliberate defence of Tilda at the table had rattled the Colonel's careful plan out of its patient shape into something considerably more urgent. The second letter was the most dangerous thing Danwick had ever written. He had composed it 2 weeks before, as a reserve measure, the kind careful mancan keeps waiting for the moment his first moves fail. It was addressed to 3 people simultaneously. Lord Alton Wentfield, a prominent social columnist known in certain circles as a reliable disperser of damaging information, and a senior figure at the county legal registry. The letter claimed the Duke had entered a private financial arrangement with Lord Alton in exchange for Tilda's placement at Grenvar, built from enough half-true details to be difficult to deny cleanly. The implication it carried was that Tilda was not a bride being genuinely considered, but a transaction being completed, which would strip from her the only thing more important than her presence at Grenvar, her dignity. It would not destroy the Duke, but it would make keeping Tilda politically costly. And Danwick knew the Duke well enough to hope that a man who had spent 8 years carefully rebuilding Grenvar's standing would not choose a woman over his estate's reputation. That was the calculation. Theo reached the yard gate 30 seconds behind Grout and called out from the lane. Grout stopped. Theo planted himself in the middle of the path with the particular stillness of a man who manages large, willful animals and has learned that projection of intent matters far more than physical size. He held out his hand. Grout stood there for a long moment. The lane was dark and the house behind them was quiet, and there was nothing ahead of him worth protecting anymore. He handed over the letter. Theo brought it to Silas, who was still at his desk because Silas was always at his desk at that hour. He managed a large estate, and sleep was a courtesy he extended to himself only after the day was thoroughly finished. Silas read the letter fully. His face did not change while he read it, but when he set it down, he sat very still for a moment in a way that communicated precisely how serious it was. He resealed it with careful hands and went to the Duke's study for the 3rd time that week. The Duke read it standing by the desk. He did not speak immediately when he finished. He set the letter down and stood with his head slightly lowered and his jaw tight, and the fire in the grate the only moving thing in the room. Silas counted the silence in his own quiet way. He reached 40 seconds before the Duke straightened. Tell Burrell to secure the west wing gate. Grout's stays on the property tonight. He picked up the letter. Find Danwick. Danwick was still fully dressed when Silas knocked. He came to the study with composed steps and a face arranged for negotiation. The door closed behind him. Nobody heard what passed between them in the following 20 minutes. Silas had, with his customary efficiency, found reasons to position every available staff member at the far end of the house. The corridor outside the study was empty and stayed empty until midnight. When the Duke opened the door himself, Danwick walked out of the study altered in ways that showed only to those who knew how to look. His posture held. His face remained arranged, but something behind his eyes had been reorganized by force and would not return to its previous position. The Duke looked at Silas. "The West Rooms will need clearing. Colonel Danwick departs Thursday. His man departs with him." "Yes, Your Grace." Danwick said nothing. He walked back toward the West Wing and turned the corner and was gone. In the morning, he told Petra at breakfast that a prior obligation had recalled him urgently from the county. His delivery was smooth. Only someone watching the small muscles around his jaw would have noticed what that smoothness cost him. Petra received the news with the polished grace of a woman who understands when a situation has rearranged itself beneath her and adjusts accordingly. Tilda came to breakfast after both of them were already seated. She looked at Danwick once. He met her eyes for a fraction of a second and looked at his plate. She sat, poured her tea, and said nothing. She knew. Not every detail, not Theo's part, or the contents of the letter, or the midnight conversation. But she knew from the particular quality of the stillness around Danwick that something had broken open in the night and settled badly for him. She was not surprised. She had watched people like him long enough to understand that they almost always make one move too many. Patience is its own kind of power, and she had practiced it longer than most. Across the table, the Duke arrived last. He sat, looked at Tilda with the direct and fully present attention that was simply his natural response to things that mattered to him, and said, "After breakfast, I would like to show you something. The northern drainage, further than that." Petra's eyes moved between them. After the meal, the Duke led Tilda past the formal gardens and the east outbuildings along a path she had not yet taken, through a stand of old ash trees whose upper branches were bare and reaching into a clearing at the crest of a long gradual rise. The valley of Grenvar opened below them, all of it. The fields, the river line, the tenant chimneys making their slow smoke, the hall itself set broad and grey in the far distance. Looking from this height, less like a grand house and more like something that had grown from the ground it stood on rather than being placed upon it. He was quiet for a moment, then he spoke without looking away from the view. "My father lost half of this before I reached 20. Not through cruelty, through pride. He made decisions that felt like strength and cost the land and the people working it. I spent 8 years buying back what he spent." He turned and looked at her. "You walked onto this estate, and in 3 days you saw what that cost had been. The wall and the drainage and the cottages. You wrote it out and submitted it without announcement or performance. You simply saw what was here and said so. Any careful person would. No, his tone was not hard, but it was definite. They would not. I have had guests in this house who did not see it in 3 months. The wind came steadily up the valley slope, cold and honest. Danwick is gone, he said. What he attempted to do, to use your family's opinion of you as a tool against your position here, I have ended it. Tilda looked at him fully. And the letter he sent to my mother before any of this? He did not flinch. "I cannot undo that. But what he claimed and what your family's view of you implies will not stand in this house. It was never true. It was always their failure of sight, not a fact about you." Something moved through her that was not relief, because she had never been waiting for rescue, and not gratitude exactly, though it was near that. Something more like recognition, the precise feeling of being seen, fully and correctly, by the right pair of eyes in the right light at last. She turned toward the valley. If work on the north drainage begins this week, the ground will still hold before the freeze. He stood beside her and looked out at the same view. "I know," he said. She found Petra waiting at the bottom of the path when she came back down through the ash trees. Petra stood where the tree line thinned, with her arms folded and the wind pulling at her hair in a way she did not acknowledge. She had the posture of a woman who has decided on a conversation, regardless of whether the other person is ready for it. "We should speak," Petra said. Tilda stopped and waited. "What is happening here?" There was something in Petra's voice that had not been there at dinner. Something underneath the surface of it, less composed than usual. "I live here now." "That is not what I mean." Tilda looked at her eldest sister and thought about all the years of those breakfast tables and drawing rooms and the easy, careless quality of people who never need to be directly cruel because their indifference does the same work without the effort. She thought about the morning she had left Crestbury with her single trunk while her mother stood in the doorway without a coat, and her father had already gone back inside before the carriage moved. "You came here because a letter from someone in this house told your mother there was something worth worrying about," Tilda said. "The person who wrote that letter is leaving Thursday. He used you because he believed the family's opinion of me would be a useful instrument. He was wrong about the Duke, and about this house, and about me." A long silence settled between them. For the first time in Tilda's memory, Petra had no answer ready. She stood in the thinning trees and looked at her younger sister with an expression she had not worn in her presence before. Something genuine was moving underneath it. "He looks at you differently," Petra said finally. "The Duke? Yes, then he looks at anyone." "Yes." Petra unfolded her arms. She looked toward the hall in the distance and then back. "I will tell Mama you are well. Tell her I am better than well." Petra left the following morning. She said goodbye to the Duke with her usual composure. She said goodbye to Tilda at the doorway quietly and without performance. The carriage moved down the gravel path. Burrell closed the gate. The morning went still again. Thursday came with frost. Colonel Pris Danwick descended the main staircase of Grenvar Hall at 8:30 with 2 leather trunks carried by Grout and a face arranged in the expression of a man who has decided, as a final act of dignity, to leave without acknowledging that he has been made to leave. The Duke was not present in the entrance hall. This was not an oversight. Silas stood at the door and managed the departure with perfect correctness. Every courtesies extended, nothing warm offered. Danwick shook the steward's hand with the brief pressured grip of a man swallowing something bitter. He said no goodbyes to the household staff. He did not look for Tilda. Grout followed his master to the carriage without lifting his eyes from the gravel. Burrell opened the gate. The carriage passed through. He closed it again with his customary deliberateness, the iron latch settling into place with the sound of something concluded. Mrs. Callow watched from the east window and said nothing, which from her was satisfaction at its fullest expression. Dotty was supposed to be making beds in the upper hall. She was at a different window entirely. She turned to the girl beside her and pressed both hands flat to her chest and closed her eyes. The other girl nodded with deep sincerity and said nothing at all. Tilda was not watching the departure. She was in the library and she was not reading. She sat in the large chair beside the east window with a book open across her knee and her eyes on the fields outside. She had been there since 7, and something in her was working through things she had not yet found words for. She had spent 22 years being the third daughter, the inconvenient one, not treated badly enough to name it cruelty, and not treated well enough to call it care, simply arranged around, placed where she caused the least disruption to a family that had made its assessments early and held to them without revisiting them. She had never argued against it, not because she agreed with it, but because she understood, even as a young girl, that arguing with a verdict handed down by people who are not listening wastes the only resource you cannot replenish. She had used her energy differently. She had read everything she could reach, walked every edge of the Crestbury estate alone, learned the land and the law and the management of an estate, with the particular hunger of someone who knows that competence cannot be taken from you once it is genuinely yours. She had not expected to find here a man who already spoke that language, who did not merely tolerate it in her, but responded to it as though it were simply the natural way of things. The library door opened. The Duke came in with his usual directness and took the chair immediately beside hers, not the 1-2 seats away as was his habit. He set nothing in his hands. He had not come to read. She waited. "My father's solicitor is travelling from London next week," he said. "I have asked him to begin preparing formal documents." She looked at him. "I want this arrangement made permanent." He held her gaze. "Not because the contract your father signed requires it. That contract carries very little meaning to me. I want it permanent because I want you here, clearly recorded. Not as a placement or a convenience." He looked at her steadily. "As my wife." The fire in the grate moved and settled. Tilda set the book aside carefully. She looked at the man beside her, at his face which performed nothing, and gave her now only the plain truth of what it contained: certainty. Not the certainty of a man who has made a decision overnight and is announcing it by morning. The certainty of a man who has known something for some time and is choosing now in this room, in this light, to say it plainly. "You do not know me fully," she said, "not as a rejection, as precision. I know you saw the river wall on your 3rd morning. I know you came into this library without permission and chose an essay on agricultural reform. I know you answered Danwick's examination without one flinch. I know you told me about the drainage before you told me your middle name." He paused. "I know the way you stand at the window in the early morning before the house is properly awake and look at these fields the way I look at them, as though they are something worth understanding, not something worth owning." She was quiet for a long moment. "My family sent me here as a joke," she said. The words were level and plain, not wounded by them, not seeking anything from naming them, simply setting the truth of it on the table between them where it could be seen. I know, they expected nothing to come of it. I know that also. She looked out the window. The north field was visible from where she sat, brown and wide and patient. They were wrong, she said, about a great many things. He turned toward her fully. Are you considering it? She looked back at him. I decided before we walked to the valley, she said. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and was considerably more than one. A quiet, private thing. The kind of expression that belongs only to moments that have been waited for without knowing precisely how long the waiting has been. He nodded once. She nodded once. Outside, Silas crossed the path from the gatehouse to the east outbuilding with his ledger under his arm. He passed the library window without looking in. He had long cultivated the ability to know what he needed to know without making a visible point of knowing it. He turned up the path and walked on with his usual measured pace. In the weeks that followed, 3 things happened in close succession. The solicitor arrived from London and worked with quiet thoroughness. The formal documents were prepared with the full weight of the Duke's instruction behind them, which meant they were precise and comprehensive and left nothing unattended to. Lord Alton Wentfield received a letter from Grenvar Hall that was not the politely worded rejection he had privately been expecting and had already begun composing a response to in his head. The letter was written in the Duke's own hand, 2 pages, courteous throughout and entirely unmistakable in its meaning. The Duke of Grenvar informed Lord Alton that the matter of Miss Matilda Wentfield was settled, that she was to become Duchess of Grenvar, that the family's initial arrangement was accepted in spirit, and that no further documentation from the Wentfield side was required or requested, that future correspondence regarding the matter should be directed to Silas. Lord Alton read it at his desk, set it down, picked up his teacup, set that down also. He did not reply for 4 days, which was his particular way of managing information that required him to revise an opinion he had not known he was holding. Lady Hester received the news from her husband and went very still in the manner of a woman whose entire understanding of a situation has been restructured and who is performing the work of restructuring it in real time while allowing nothing to show on her face. She thought about the morning Tilda had left, the way she had stood at the door without a coat, the carriage pulling away and herself already thinking about what next needed managing inside the house. She thought about that for longer than she intended to. Petra heard from her mother and sat quietly in her own sitting room for some time. Sir Barton Gruel came and asked if she was well, and she told him she was simply thinking, which satisfied him completely, because Barton was a man who found thinking an entirely reasonable thing for a person to be doing and asked no further questions about it. She then wrote a letter to Tilda. The first letter she had ever written to her youngest sister that had no secondary purpose or hidden calculation behind it. It was short and honest, and far later in arriving than it should have been. It said that she was glad things had come out as they had, that it had perhaps required more of Tilda than she had previously given her credit for, that Sir Barton was preparing the Gruel estate for their coming marriage, and that she hoped they might visit Grenvar one day if Tilda was willing. Tilda read it twice. She wrote back 3 sentences. They were welcome. She was glad too. There was considerably more room at Grenvar than most people expected. She sealed it herself and gave it to Dotty to post. Dotty carried the letter the entire length of the main corridor in a state of such concentrated happiness that she very nearly walked directly into Burrell, who was coming the other direction with a coal bucket. He stepped aside and watched her pass. "Something has changed," he said to the corridor in general. "Everything has changed," said Mrs. Callow, appearing from the side passage with a set of folded table linens under her arm, having not been any part of the conversation until that moment and not appearing to find this unusual. Burrell considered this and found it entirely accurate. News of Danwick's removal from Grenvar reached his son Ferris in London through a brief note written in the Colonel's own hand. Ferris was 25, generally agreeable, and had never fully grasped the specifics of his father's plans for Grenvar, only the broad outline of them, which had always seemed to him more distant than immediate. The note said simply that the arrangement had not proceeded, and that he should position himself elsewhere. Ferris read it, folded it, and went to his club, where he ordered a large meal and thought very little further about it. He had another approach forming by the following Tuesday, involving a merchant's daughter in Berkshire, who had not yet been informed of his interest. In this way, as in most things, Ferris resembled neither of his parents, and the wider world was largely comfortable for it. On the first properly cold morning of November, Tilda stood at the library window before the house was fully awake. The north field had been worked. The drainage channels were cut and settled against the coming freeze. The river wall repair was complete, each stone packed and sealed in the method she had written from memory at a small desk on her second morning at Grenvar. The method a groundsman at Crestbury had used when she was a girl, and nobody thought she was paying attention. She had been paying attention. She was always paying attention. She had written the proposal. Theo had carried it. The Duke had approved it. The work had been done. That was simply how things moved here, clearly and practically, and without energy wasted on pretending a problem was not present. She had always lived this way in her mind. She had simply never had the ground for it before. She heard the library door and did not turn. The Duke came and stood beside her at the window. Neither of them spoke immediately. They looked at the same frost, the same bare patient field, the same thin winter sky. "The solicitor left the final papers yesterday," he said. "I saw them. You did not sign them. I was going to do it this morning." He turned and looked at her profile, at the loose strand of hair near her jaw that the morning had pulled free exactly as it had. On the first day, she arrived in his courtyard from a carriage with no crest on its door, and a satchel in her hand, and the particular steadiness of a woman who had made a decision somewhere on the road and intended to keep it. "You are not afraid?" he said. "No." She turned and looked at him. "Are you?" He considered this with the genuine, unhurried attention he gave to everything that mattered. "Not of this?" he said. "Not of you." She turned back to the window. Outside, the frost lay white, and even across the north field. The river ran past the repaired wall. The tenant chimneys made their smoke in the still cold air. Grenvar Hall stood solid and serious, and full of weight and history, and the particular deep quiet of a place where things are beginning, after a very long time, to be exactly what they were always meant to be. Behind her, she heard the Duke move, and she heard, softly, the sound of a pen being lifted from the desk. She turned. He held it toward her. She took it.